It's a delight to be here and see so many former students. Having taught 6,000 students at Samford and Auburn and having done my undergraduate work at Howard College, you can imagine how many of those 6,000 people are here in the Birmingham area. And it's really great to have reunions. We really don't have anything equivalent to War Eagle at Samford, but I got an awful lot of affirmation earlier, so thank you. I'm going to do the presentations at IPC in two parts. Today I just want to have a conversation with you sort of about broad issues of public policy. Tonight I want to do a sort of conservative orthodox biblicism look at poverty. And I want to contrast what I'm going to do tonight to what Henry Edmonds would have done if Dr. Edmonds had been here today in place of me. And this is in fact what he did do. First at South Highlands Presbyterian Church, beginning in the teens and extending to his work at Independent Presbyterian Church after October 1915, when this church was founded. Much of this that I'm going to talk about today is from work that you can read in op-ed columns from wonderful papers like the Anniston Star. And other things that I'm going to say today can be found in an anthology which I'm sending to the University of Alabama Press next month called Southern Religion and Christian Diversity between 1890 and 2015. Actually, this is a series of 15 articles that I've written beginning in 1969 and culminating in a series of lectures I've done across the United States the last 3 years called The South's Battle Over God. And the particular focus of what I'm going to do here today is from a lecture I did in the Chancellor's Symposium series at the University of Mississippi in 1989 entitled Feeding the Hungry and Ministering to the Brokenhearted, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S. and the Social Gospel, 1900 and 1920. Three of the articles in the anthology that I'm putting together deal with religion in Birmingham. And that's a much more complex problem than you probably know. For instance, in the first religious census of the United States, which was published in 1906, I wonder if any of you can name the largest religious denomination in the city in 1906. Catholics. I heard it on the left side. Good for you. That is so counterintuitive that you just sort of, you can say, well, they must have won like in the last second, the score tied up for me. I knew you'd appreciate the humor. Not quite. 28% of those who claimed a church membership in Birmingham in 1906 were Roman Catholic, followed by Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was 18%, followed by Black Baptist at 17%, followed in fifth place by Southern Baptist at 8% of the population. So Southern Baptists were still primarily a rural, small town denomination, and Birmingham was exploding, but it wasn't exploding by whites moving into town. It was exploding by blacks coming from the Black Belt to take the jobs of coal mining and ore mining and in the pipe shops and the steel mills. It was expanding by large numbers of Italian and Eastern European immigrants pouring into the city. It was expanding by lots of people moving into a place which was so new that it was wholly like Montgomery, where Henry Edmonds had his first pastorate at First Baptist Church, First Presbyterian Church, Montgomery, and in a community in which you were born into leadership and wealth and influence, where you did not earn it by the capacity of your work. And he moved to Birmingham, a city which was just reversed. There was no such thing as an aristocracy. There was no such thing as old families. There was no such thing as a kind of wealth that existed prior to the creation of wealth by your hard work and your imagination. And as a result of that, South Highlands Presbyterian was a much different kind of church than First Presbyterian in Montgomery when Henry Edmonds moved here. Furthermore, and as I'm trying to emphasize in the series of 15 articles, Birmingham was much more like Pittsburgh than Birmingham was like Montgomery or Mobile. It had tenements, it had wide open brothels, an entire mid-light district in Birmingham, first scattered all over the city, and then for sake of social control, zoning, put it all in one area. It had saloons. It was called the murder capital of America. On any given year, when Henry Edmonds first moved here, there were more murders in Birmingham than in the United Kingdom. Just to give you an example of how wild, wicked, frontier-like this city was. Therefore, the problems that gave rise to the social gospel movement and its corollary in theology, usually theological liberalism, would have a home here which it would not have in Montgomery, it would not have in Mobile. But it is amazing how often you find this same pattern if you look at comparable sized cities in the South, which were undergoing rapid change and rapid immigration patterns. Think Louisville, Kentucky, think Tampa, Florida, think New Orleans, think Atlanta. All of these were undergoing the same kind of turmoil and traumatic change that religion in Birmingham was undergoing. Here's the theological issue that Henry Edmonds confronted as he left York, Alabama, and Sumter County as black belt can possibly get, from an upper middle class family that believed in education, and despite the limitations of their financial resources, put him in a private military academy in Demopolis, from which he then went to the University of Tennessee, where he was a 3-star athlete. If you did not know that, football, track, baseball. Then his first job was teaching school in Georgia. From there he went to Center College, a wonderful liberal arts college in Kentucky, and he was athletic director, and also headed the YMCA, the Fusion, the two great interests of his life. From there he went to Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and already there was this tension between the Calvinism, the strict Calvinism of his Presbyterian tradition, and the growing exposure to the new German liberal theology, the new theology that was coming out of Heidelberg, Nuremberg, Berlin, lots of other places. Higher criticism of the Bible, questions about the application of philology and anthropology and philosophy to the Bible. Questions about whether mythology means something didn't happen, or whether mythology, as Joseph Campbell suggested, always is rooted in a core of reality and truth and historical fact, but that mythology always is used by us to have a meaning that is relevant to us, and therefore the story of Noah may not be a real story about dinosaurs on a boat, but it may be a real story about the human odyssey, like, say, the Greek stories of the human odyssey, Iliad, Odyssey. Or the Garden of Eden story, which is a profound story, maybe not so much about what was happening in the world before 1914, but maybe profoundly about what was happening in the world from 1914 to 1918, which shattered liberal theology, and then the Second World War finished it off. How can you not believe in sin and evil if you lived through 2 wars that took the lives of 100 million people and wiped out nearly an entire religion? We were optimistic in the 19th century and until 1914 We were not so optimistic after that, which is also part of the Henry Edmonds story. Have any of you ever heard of Walter Lingle, L-I-N-G-L-E? Oh, I knew you would. I was wondering when your hand was going up. There is a great Presbyterian theologian. Despite the fact that in Birmingham we know best the story of our person, Henry Edmonds, and the church he founded. In a larger context, Walter Lingle was much more important than Henry Edmonds for two reasons. One, at the time, he had a much more prominent role in organized Presbyterian church life. He, unlike Henry Edmonds and IPC, remained in the Presbyterian Church of the U.S., whereas in October 1920, this church joined the Presbyterian Church USA, which was the northern wing of Presbyterianism. Symbolically, the first church, so far as I know in the state, a group of Methodists who never seceded from the Methodist Church, but very small. And IPC rejoined the National Presbyterian Church. The Methodists didn't get around to it until half a century later. Southern Baptists have never quite made it. We're slower in that regard than most people. So, Walter Lingle, within the context of Presbyterianism, is the pastor of Atlanta First Presbyterian Church, which was going through the same kind of change. At the same time, he is a contemporary of Edmonds. He then became the professor, and notice the title, Christian Sociology. The application of a new social science to the problems of the church and Christian ethics at Union Seminary in Richmond, the premier PCUS seminary. Then he became editor of the Union Theological Review, which was the major theological magazine which people like Henry Edmonds read. Then he was a columnist for Presbyterians of the South, and then he was editor of Christian Observer. Then he was president of the Layman's Seminary School for Presbyterians in Richmond, and finally he ended his career as the president of the premier Presbyterian college in the South, and some would add one of the premier colleges in the United States then and now, Davidson College in North Carolina. So here's a guy who stays within the fold. Henry Edmonds goes outside the fold, and here's a man who has huge influence because of that. The historian of the PCUS wrote of Lingle, he was never so far in advance of the church that he could not gain a hearing, but always far enough ahead of the church to broaden the church's viewpoint. Which I might add is sort of the eternal conundrum for religious people. Do you get so far away from the roots that produced you that you finally are kicked out or choose to leave? Henry Edmonds. Or do you push and push and push and push a sort of lover's quarrel with Presbyterianism, but you remain in the institutional church because you realize if you can somehow take it with you, the cumulative power of an institution is greater than the individual prophetic vision of a single person. If you have an easy answer to that, when I finish today, when you come up. So here are some of Walter Lingle's sermon topics. The Bible and money. Praise. Money is not inherently evil, but abuses such as paying unjust wages are. We were apt to allow the wage scale to be determined by the laws of political economy and not by the teachings of Christ. 1914. Our wealth and social problems. Sermon from 1916. Income data shows the income of the 9 richest men in America is a wide disparity between the rest of society. America's problem is the concentration of power to control money, markets, prices, and wages, which creates social unrest. The alternative model he suggested was a Presbyterian layman in Atlanta named John J. Egan. Tuck that name in your memory bank because I want to talk about him in a minute. Lingle's best-known publication was a book called The Bible and Social Problems, which was the result of the James Flynt lecture at Union Theological Seminary in 1929. One chapter of his book was called The Bible and Poverty. This is what he wrote. Christians should study the teachings of Jesus regarding how they should treat others, because Jesus' ideal for the world is that the kingdom of God should come here on earth as it already has come in heaven. Parenthetically, John J. Egan was from South Georgia, was a very successful businessman, extremely wealthy. He was a longtime elder in Central Presbyterian Church in Atlanta. He was the founder of Perry College. He began Raymond Yap Nkuchi School, bless you, and he founded a SIPCO. And he not only founded a SIPCO, he created an entirely new model of American capitalism. Because at a SIPCO, when Henry Edmunds first came to Birmingham, there was a workers' operatives group that the workers elected to manage the company, and there was a management group elected by the leaders of the corporation. And these two groups went together to determine policy. And for instance, according to my former pastor, John Jeffers, whose first job was at the SIPCO, he remembered a group of black men who worked there saying, why is it that white people have showers and black people don't have showers? We're just as dirty when we get off the job, even if you can't see us. And all of a sudden, before the workers, the operatives group and the workers group, and I said, well, of course, they need showers just like we need showers. So there were the black showers, white showers. Can you imagine a world in which African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama were helping to make decisions about the quality of their work? They had a profit-sharing program at the very beginning of the SIPCO. The higher the profit margin, the more the workers made as bonuses. It is no wonder that, according to John Jeffers, my former pastor at Auburn First Baptist, who grew up out in Tarrant City, it is no wonder that when you growing up in high school in Birmingham in the 1930s, your dream was to work for a SIPCO. It was the best corporation in Birmingham. And it was a corporation which embodied what economists now call cooperative capitalism or social welfare capitalism. The model for that for the entire nation was Birmingham, Alabama. That was because of a Presbyterian minister who literally followed the teachings of Christ. When I finish today, I would invite you to take one of these 5 or all of these. They're laid out right to left as you're facing me. If you'll just pick one up in that order. The first one is my commentary on the Epistle of James. I'm going to read you a passage in a minute. The second is from the book of Proverbs, and this results from a course I taught my first year of retirement at Stanford University in Jan term called The Bible and Poverty, and it was an attempt to root the questions I'm going to deal with today and tonight in the framework of the Bible. Henry Edmunds would have done sociology of religion, and I'm going to stay where I was rooted, which is in the Bible. This particular handout is the entire argument I'm going to make this morning and tonight out of the book of Proverbs alone. This represents one of 2,100 passages in the Bible that deal with the subject I'm talking about today. There is one topic that is dealt with more in the Bible than the topic I'm dealing with today, and that topic is idolatry. That is the only topic. If you look in the New Testament, 1 in every 16 verses. If you look in the Gospels, it's 1 of every 14 verses. If you look in Luke, it's 1 of every 7 verses. If you look in the Epistle of James, it's 1 of every 5 verses. I'm not going to embarrass any of you by saying how often do you hear a pastor speak about the Bible and poverty. But I'll bet you hear a lot of sermons about abortion, homosexuality, personal ethics, divorce, drinking, maybe you don't, or just how you ought to live your life every day. I find that if we would stick with the Bible and just allocate the appropriate amount of time that we find in the Bible to contemporary American issues, we would have a big argument, for instance, about how often we ought to sing God Bless America, and does it become the iconography of an alternative religion. I love the song, but it was written during the First World War to celebrate America's goodness and righteousness. And as a historian looking back on the origins of World War I, I'm not so sure. So maybe instead of just bringing our American flag into the pulpit, maybe we should ask to what degree does the American flag substitute an American culture for the pulpit? And how much reinforcement does it need from our congregational worship? The third handout is Poverty, Wealth, and the Bible. And it takes a sort of broad look at this subject by just going around from the Old Testament to the New Testament. This sort of light printed one is a commentary that I've been doing as I read through the Bible. I try to do this about every 7 or 8 years. I read all the way through the Bible. And I'm just taking out every single passage that has to do with the poor. So you'll get all of that. And the last one is the status of children in Alabama in 2012, which is sociology of religion. And with this, very simply, do you happen to know the demographic group of Americans who were the poorest in 1935 in the United States? Which demographic? Age group? Old people. Old people. You're right, black too. But old people. They were by actual breaking down the demography of the United States, the single demographic that was poorest, old people, 65 and older. And I think probably pretty much all of you know the largest demographic now, children. Which brings me to perhaps the preeminent historical focus and perspective that I can bring to today, which is that I want to disabuse you of a fallacy which is paralyzing our conversation about righteousness, justice, and poverty in America. And that is that American history is static and we're doing the very best we can. That poverty is static and there's nothing much more we can do because all the programs have failed. Truth of the matter is, if you read The Economist, for instance, you will quickly discover that America is in fact the most vigorous, vital, and capable of changing nation in the world. We have an amazing capacity for change in our history. And there is no better evidence of that, in fact, than poverty. Let me give you statistical data, because we unfortunately live in parallel worlds. And as a social scientist, I always say, what's the basis for your opinion? And on the other hand, we have vast numbers of Americans who say in a democratic society, I don't have to have any data because my opinion is worth as much as yours. Well, if I believe that, all 6,000 of my students would be made A's, right? Because they all have data. You know, if you go into college with that assumption, you flunk out. You know what I'm saying? Because the whole point of education is to say, if your opinion is not informed, your opinion doesn't matter in an educated world. But that doesn't mean that you can't look at data and draw different conclusions. And in fact, I remember my first class at Florida State University where I had the president of the Young People's Socialist League and the president of the Young Americans for Freedom in the same class. The most right-wing Republican group, the most left-wing Democratic group, and they both made high A's. And they didn't agree on anything, on the exams, which were all essay, or in their political culture. But the point is they argue the point well. 1960, 20% of Americans were poor, below the poverty line. 55% of blacks were poor, below the poverty line. Of African Americans in the United States ages 25 through 29, 4.6% had attended college in 1960. 2012, 24% of African Americans were poor. So the percentages have fallen dramatically from 55% to 24%. And in terms of African Americans ages 18 through 24, who either were then attending or had already graduated college, the figure was 40%. We go from 4.6% in 1960 to 40% in college or graduated by 2012. If you look at total poverty rates, 20% in 1960, 10% in 1970, 13% in 2005, 15% in 2012. Or to put it another way, you can say, well, the war on poverty failed. Or you can say, with the economists, that there are a lot of factors about a robust economy and a market-driven economy in the 1990s, which absorbed the poorest in the economy. Both of those are good arguments. The conservative argument and the liberal argument, both important. Though the economist argues from its libertarian viewpoint, you probably gain something from both perspectives. But my point is, there are 1/5 less people in America poor in 2014 than there were in 1960. And you may say, well, that's a fairly small decline, only 25%, but if you happen to be in 25%, it's really important. Furthermore, and I think perhaps this is the most important data set I'll give you, every year, 1 in 4 of the people who were poor at the first of the year are no longer poor at the end of the year. That is really an important statistic. Now, what confuses that statistic is that our demographic is now primarily people of color. Those who are having babies are basically people of color, and in 2042 we'll be a majority minority nation. In 2017, our public schools in Alabama will be majority minority. So if the birth rate is explosively among Hispanics and African Americans, I think 50,000 new Hispanics are reaching voting age every week in the United States. And think of them entering the population from predominantly, unfortunately, single-parent families, and therefore about 4 to 10 times more likely to be poor, depending upon where they live and so forth, the education quality, than white children. So all of a sudden you're replacing the one who's dropping out with a vast kind of demographic shift in our culture. What time am I supposed to be through? Really? Okay, 2:10. Okay. Now what I want to do is suggest to you that in 1915, Henry Edmonds and a group of people from South Island Presbyterian Church who got into a terrible theological argument because Henry Edmonds had changed, as we often do when we grow from one stage of life, one passage to another. Henry Edmonds no longer believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. He no longer believed in inherent evil, the whole metaphor, the whole mythology of the Garden of Eden and the introduction of sin into the world, he no longer believed. He no longer believed that human beings are atoms of self-interest and narcissistic, and therefore that they could be educated and that the world could get better from education. And furthermore, he felt that although you might choose to believe in the Immaculate Conception of Jesus and his resurrection, it was not really necessary to believe that in order to be a Christian. He felt that to be a Christian, you needed to do what the Chinese would say, follow the Tao, the way of the Tao. Or to put it another way, you become like the person you follow. The way you follow determines that. And I'm going to emphasize this tonight in more dramatic ways, but let me just say that at this point, the stool of religion is supported by 4 legs: belief, liturgy, personal ethics, social ethics. And almost none of you are equally good at the 4. So you might say, the stew always tilts a little because one leg is a little shorter than the other. Southern Christians, for instance, are liturgically pretty weak, except for Catholics and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox and High Church Episcopalians. We don't do liturgy. We don't even put much emphasis on liturgy. We put a lot of emphasis on belief, and we probably do believe better in the South than any other group of Christians in America. Personal ethics, I'm not so sure, but we think we're great at personal ethics. I would just point out that the highest divorce rates in America are among independent Pentecostals, and the second highest divorce rates are among Southern Baptists. And of course, their argument is that that's because they actually bother to get married.
They actually bother to get married.
And that may be, in fact, a wonderful sociological answer, but I doubt that Jesus is impressed with it. Whatever you want to believe. I had an administrative secretary when I was chair of the history department at a distinguished university professor at Auburn. She was from the Northeast. She was a non-practicing Catholic. And her vocabulary was somewhat different from mine, and not necessarily the best way of getting things done at Auburn. She just, went into this vituperative kind of profane fit when something wasn't done right. She was very efficient, but it wasn't a good strategy. And from time to time, I found that because she didn't have a religious network in Auburn, that she would come in with personal problems, and she'd close the door, and we'd sit, and I'd morph back to minister of youth at Park Memorial Baptist Church in 1961, and I'd listen to her. And we really developed a wonderful relationship, and I helped her work out a really, really hard personal ethical problem. And she raised this question about the ethics of Southerners, and she said, I don't really see much difference. I see a difference in what you proclaim, but I don't see much difference in the way you act. And then she sent me this little email, and I know y'all get these stupid things like I do, but this is pretty good. A driver did the right thing. He stopped at the crosswalk, even though he could have beaten the red light by accelerating through the intersection. The tailgating woman behind him went ballistic, pounding on her horn, screaming in frustration as she missed her chance to drive through the intersection with him. Still in mid-rant, she heard a tap on her window and looked into the face of a very serious police officer. The officer ordered her to exit her car with her hands up. He took her to the police station where she was searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a cell. After a couple of hours, the policeman approached the cell and opened the door. She was escorted back to the booking desk where the arresting officer was waiting with all of her personal effects. He said, I'm awfully sorry for my mistake. You see, I pulled you up behind your car while you were blowing your horn and flipping the guy off in front of you and cussing the blue streak at him. And I noticed on the back of your car your Choose Life license plate holder and your What Would Jesus Do bumper sticker, and followed me to Sunday school bumper sticker, and a chrome-plated Christian fish on your trunk. Naturally, I assumed you had stolen the car. That is the difference between personal ethics and social ethics. When you're a driver and you process social ethics, your concern is for the welfare of all the people around you. But in personal ethics, it's all about whether you give somebody the finger or whether you cuss at them. And what he was doing is trying to impose her bumper sticker personal ethics on her driving habits, which is incidentally not a bad thing to do in the South. And I do it all the time by using the Bible to say, you are not what you claim to be. Because it is so clear what this book says. I chose the King James for James 5. Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as if it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Behold, the hiring laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you, kept back by fraud, and they crieth against you. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. Ye have lived in pleasure on the earth and have wanton. Ye have nourished your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. That's the King James Version of the good life, the life of justice, the life of righteousness. Jesus told it in the 25th chapter of Matthew, beginning with verse 31, going through verse 46, and you all know it. You get to heaven, and the first question in heaven is not what you believe about abortion. It's not what you believe about homosexuality, our separation, church and state. The first question is what? Exactly. You saw the hungry, did you feed them? You saw the thirsty, did you give them drink? You saw the foreigner, did you take him in? You saw the sick, did you go and visit them and bind them up? You saw the alien, and you welcomed them. And as much as you did unto them, you did unto me. Enter into my kingdom, prepared you for you since the beginning of time. For you did to them what you would have done to me. And you belong to this kingdom. And we don't say, yeah, but you can't believe how right we are in what we think. And he says, if what you think matches my gospel, then why didn't you feed them? And so what gets you into hell is not what you believe. It's the inability to connect your ethics to what you believe. So the question is not, what would Jesus do? It's how would Jesus live? Jesus is the Tao. And you follow the Tao, and you become like the Tao, the way, or as John said in his gospel, the Word. That is precisely what Henry Edmonds did in his church when he created the Fresh Air Farm in 1923, because there were massive numbers now, get this, of white children who were incredibly poor, working in Ensley and Fairfield, and even South Highlands before he started this church. He had already taken missions, and he said, missions to Africa and China are great, but we got children in Ensley and Fairfield who are just as deprived and their families just as poor as people in Africa and Asia. So we're going to start missions in Boyles, north of Birmingham. We're going to start missions in Ensley and Fairfield. And the first social settlement houses were Methodist and Presbyterian out in Ensley and Fairfield. And then in 1923, with the help of Robert Meyer, a Jew, he got to know him through the first services of this church between 1915 and 1923 at Temple Emmanuel. And Robert Meyer said, Henry Edmonds had the idea of the Fresh Air Farm, and a Jew, Robert Meyer, funded it. And before he retired in 1942, Henry Edmonds had seen 5,000 children go up to Shades Mountain for 2 5-week periods, where they could get out of their environment and have a different environment. And then Independent Presbyterian created winter work, and the winter work continued, the work that had begun with these children and their families by visiting the families. This church hired a retired Presbyterian missionary to Japan. And you know where her ministry was? It was to the saloons and the brothels of Birmingham. This retired, single, Japanese female missionary goes to the brothels, and she works with the women who work at the brothels. She goes to the saloons, and she works with the barkeepers and the drunks and the street people. And then this church hired the first social worker, founded by the inspiration of the Southern Sociological Congress, an incredible organization that began in 2012, almost synonymous with the origins of this church. And your social worker for this church became the one who was translating the changes in social justice from across America into Birmingham through Independent Presbyterian Church. This church hired the first public health nurse in the history of Jefferson County. And after she worked with people who would come from all over town here to get medical care because they couldn't get it anywhere else. She became the first public health nurse hired by Jefferson County, coming from this church. This church created the first employment league in the city of Birmingham in order to help people who could not find jobs have an advocate for them who would help them find jobs. It is amazing the effect this church had on the city of Birmingham in those transitional years between 1915 and 1942. Some of my evangelical brothers and sisters have constantly chided me that I'm trying to bury the gospel of Jesus Christ in social institutions and social justice. To which I reply, not exactly, I'm just trying to follow Jesus. Talk like Jesus. Do what I think Jesus would do if he were still here. But let me tell you my deep theological belief about poverty and the rightness of this church's position. The most tragic heresy in the history of Christianity, in my view, is the separation of social justice and personal evangelism. And we have pushed each other by our theological arguments so that evangelicals like me, I proudly claim to be a Baptist evangelical, though I'm no longer Southern Baptist. I witnessed to my Catholic student when she was trying to decide whether to have an abortion or not because of her serious mental problems and her belief that she could not handle a child. I did not tell her what to do. I just asked her to think about all the issues of her religion, and that ultimately she answered to God and to no one else. And she decided to have this baby, and the baby is now about to start college. And she has had the most wonderful motherhood you can imagine, and this has helped her get her head back together. That's what I call evangelism. I didn't read the Bible to her. I told her some wonderful gospel stories she ought to read, like the Sermon on the Mount. But my point is, I did not push her in one direction or the other direction. Evangelicalism starts off with the assumption that there is no bridge between social justice and personal conversion. And unfortunately, the conversionists have pushed those who advocate social justice away from the church, and evangelicals have pushed the social gospel people away from the church. What I would like to do is get back to where we were in the Gospels, which is a just and righteous society with 2,100 passages to prove it. At the same time, a command that you think about following Jesus, because Jesus is the way and the word. There is some theology which I will expound